Hey, welcome back to the Progressive Brothers Podcast. This is episode 11. Here are my co-hosts, Renaissance Man.
Hey, what's up? Welcome back, everyone. Please like the video. Peace to everyone in the chat.
All right. So, the fight for 15. What is this about? So, the fight for 15 is about raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. And there's been a lot of pushback from different entities that have basically stated that, putting $15 into this the infrastructure bill or even the COVID relief package was too early. It's too much, too soon, and there's a lot of fear mongering amongst conservatives that basically this is too much to ask for too soon inside of a bill package. And so, wait another, fiscal year or something like that to maybe launch this and get this off the ground. What do you think about this, Renaissance?
I think it's something that's definitely needed now. We just had the jobs report come out the other day, essentially saying that the economy created a lot fewer jobs than people anticipated. We got a ways to go to this recovery. There's some dispute amongst a lot of conservative states are claiming that, or using this to say that basically people are not going, basically there are jobs that need to be filled and people are not going out and filling them. And I believe South Carolina, along with maybe like Arkansas, I believe, have basically said they're cutting and terminating federal unemployment benefits. Basically, they feel people are not going back to work. I feel this would be really good for the economy. It'd be really good for lifting people out of poverty, as well as doing something for the first line workers who pretty much carry people through this pandemic. This pandemic pretty much showed how vital, for people who work in factories, retail workers, all of that were. I mean, essentially, you had one point where there was no toilet paper and there was no paper towels. Essentially, those were scarce goods, and it was because of shortage of shipping and supply chains getting disrupted. A lot of frontline workers. So I definitely think it would be a good thing, but I think it's because of what we've seen recently with a lot of these people on the right, it's going to be weaponized and they're going to push back against it. Just because they're going to say there are enough jobs already and people aren't filling it, and it's going to hurt businesses. But I'm definitely in favor of it in the long term.
Yeah, and I agree with that as well. I think that there's a lot of misinformation about federal minimum wage versus state minimum wage and things of that nature. And so I found a report, the Joint Economic Committee, Congressman Don Beyer, Vice Chair, the economic state of Black America in 2020. So let me read this real quick and kind of give a backdrop as to why the fight for 15 actually matters. Over the past half century, Black Americans have made substantial social and economic progress, gaining political rights that long had been denied to them, entering professions from which they had been blocked, and largely overcoming centuries of overt racism and oppression. While there are only 5 Black members of Congress when the Civil Rights Act became law in 1964, there currently are 56 Black members of Congress, including 12% of the House of Representatives. Black activists, scholars, and social commentators have raised awareness about the importance of diversity and shape the national conversation around race and inequality. There has been a proliferation of Black writers, screenwriters, artists, poets, athletes, and musicians who have become superstars in their respective fields, and the 21st century saw the election of the first Black American, Barack Obama, as President of the United States. Millions of Black Americans also have benefited from the opportunities created by the end of Jim Crow, entering the middle class for the first time, earning undergraduate and advanced degrees, receiving higher wages, and achieving professional success, and raising children who will build on their achievements. Leading indicators of economic prosperity and other measures of well-being also have traded upward for most of this period, with increased life expectancy, increased household incomes, and substantial gains in educational attainment. However, these very visible signs of improvement mask deep inequities that relegate tens of millions of Black Americans to second-class status, with far fewer opportunities to achieve good health, political influence, prosperity, and security than other Americans. The majority of Americans fail to recognize the magnitude of these problems. For example, a 2019 study found that over 97% of respondents vastly underestimated the huge gap between the median wealth held by Black families, $17,000, and white families, $171,000, a ratio of 10 to 1. Respondents estimated the gap to be 80 percentage points smaller than the actual divide. The data reveal a much different story, with leading indicators of social and economic well-being showing that, on average, Black Americans face much more difficult circumstances than their white counterparts. For example, Black Americans take home less income, are far less likely to own their homes, and live shorter lives than white Americans. Evaluating the economic state of Black America requires acknowledging that while the United States has made some progress, very large disparities continue to exist. Recognizing both the progress and the challenges is essential to ensuring that all Americans, including Black Americans, have a realistic chance to achieve success. Okay, so here are the key points. Despite significant economic progress over the past decades, Black Americans experience far worse economic conditions than whites or the population as a whole. Historically, the unemployment rate for Black Americans has been approximately twice the rate for whites. That is the case today, 6% for Black workers and 3.1% for whites. The difference in the unemployment rates for Blacks and whites shrinks for college graduates. However, even in the current strong economy, the unemployment rate is 50% higher for Black Americans. During the majority of the past 50 years, Black Americans have experienced unemployment rates that, were they experienced by the entire population, would be seen as recessionary. Interesting. Black workers have been disproportionately hurt by the overall decline in union membership and the decrease in power of unions. The typical Black household earns a fraction of white households, just 59 cents for every dollar. The gap between Black and white annual household income is about $29,000 per year. Black Americans are over twice as likely to live in poverty as white Americans. Black children are 3 times as likely to live in poverty as white children. The median wealth of Black families, $17,000, is less than 1/10 that of white families at $171,000. The wealth gap between Black and white households increases with education. Much less than half of Black families own their homes, compared to almost 3/4 of white families. High school graduation rates for Black and white Americans have nearly converged. The share of Blacks who are college graduates has more than doubled since 1990, from 11% to 25%, but still lags far behind whites. Persistent segregation leads to large disparities in the quality of secondary education, leading to worse economic outcomes. The incarceration rate for Black Americans is falling, but it's still 6 times the rate for white Americans. Non-Hispanic Black Americans have a life expectancy of 3.6 years lower than non-Hispanic white Americans. So what I'm going to do now is just go down to, find it, page 6. Unemployment rates for both Blacks and whites with at least a bachelor's degree were much lower, 2% for whites and 3% for Blacks, 50% higher. The current economic expansion, which began in 2009 under President Obama and is the longest on record, has helped increase the share of Black Americans in the labor force. As the labor market has tightened over the past several years, the difference between labor force participation rates for Blacks, 62.6%, and whites, 63.6%, 63.4%, has almost disappeared. This undermines the persistent stereotype that blacks are less inclined to seek work than whites, suggesting instead that they have fewer opportunities to seek employment when the economy is not operating at its peak. Black women and men have traditionally had labor force participation rates that are much similar than those of white women and men, reflecting a more gender equitable division of labor both within and outside the home. This is in part maybe due to difficult labor market conditions and discrimination against black men, which makes black women's participation critical to their families. The labor force participation rates for black women and men were 63.3% and 67.6% in January 2020, compared to 58.3% and 72% for white women and white men. So this is just before the pandemic. Field experiments have shown that resumes with typically black-sounding names receive significantly fewer callbacks for job interviews than those with white-sounding names, even when candidates had identical qualifications. A meta-analysis of these experiments has shown almost no change in the level of hiring discrimination amongst blacks over the past 25 years. There also is evidence of black employment being concentrated in occupations that have a higher risk of unemployment, often because of automation. Black workers also are at higher risk of being the first fired in the event of an economic downturn. Think of the pandemic. Labor unions have played a key role in helping black workers secure higher wages, more comprehensive benefits, and better working conditions, offering millions of blacks a pathway to joining the American middle class. Black workers have higher rates of union membership than white workers, with membership rates of 11.2% compared to 10.3% for white workers. Unionization has narrowed the wage disparity between blacks and whites, but has not eliminated it. In 2019, a unionized black man earned $948 per week compared to $1,181 for unionized white men. A relative pay gap of 80 cents to the dollar. Non-unionized black men earned $746 compared to $1,012 for non-unionized white men, or 74 cents to the dollar. Unionization made virtually no difference in the wage gap between black and white women. Unionized black women earned $874 to unionized white women's $1,044, 84 cents to the dollar, while non-unionized black women earned $683 to non-unionized white women's $810, 84 cents to the dollar. Given the reduced racial earnings gaps between unionized men in that a larger share of black workers overall is unionized. Earning gaps between black and white workers likely would be larger without unions. In addition to helping secure better wages and working conditions for black Americans, unions also played a key role in the civil rights movement, improving the lives and economic fates of all black Americans. Civil rights leaders in turn championed organized labor. A. Philip Randolph founded the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the first black labor organization chartered by the American Federation of Labor, AFL, and went on to become one of the architects of the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King Jr. was an outspoken advocate for the labor movement and created the Poor People's Campaign, a multiracial working class movement dedicated to economic equality and social justice with strong ties to organized labor. Union membership as a share of employment has been declining steeply for all Americans since the 1980s, declining by nearly half overall from 20.1% in 1983 to 10.3% in 2019. The decline for blacks has been the steepest, from 27% in 1983 to 11% in 2019. In recent years, the most significant drops have been among Black Americans whose union membership fell from 12.5% to 11.2% from 2018 to 2019. In comparison, white union membership remained relatively unchanged. The passage of right to work, quote unquote, laws in states across the country, President Trump's executive orders restricting union activities, and recent Supreme Court decisions that jeopardize collective bargaining likely will cause this decline to continue. The median annual household income for Black households in 2018 was $41,692, more than $21,000 less than all households, nearly $29,000 less for white households, which had a median income of $70,642. In other words, for every dollar earned by the typical white household, the typical Black household earned only 59 cents. This is significantly worse than in 2000, when the typical Black household earned about 65 cents for every dollar earned by a white household. So, I'm sorry, let me finish this real quick. Between 2000 and 2018, wage growth for white and Hispanic workers was faster at every decile of income than for Black workers. As a result, the gap in hourly wages between Black and white workers is largely now at every decile of income than in 2000. The past 40 years have seen rising wage inequality and stagnating wage growth in the United States. This trend has coincided with the increasing racial disparities in wages and wage growth. Wages have grown fastest for those at the top of the income distribution, including for higher earning Black workers. However, because Black workers make up a disproportionate share of the bottom of the income distribution, slow wage gains at the bottom have hit the Black community hardest. Black workers are significantly more likely to work at or below minimum wage than white workers. 2.4% of Black workers work at or below the federal minimum wage of $7.25 in 2019, compared to 1.9% of white workers. In 2018, Black workers made up 18% of minimum wage workers, despite being only 12.7% of the population, so almost a quarter. Black Americans would especially benefit from increases in the minimum wage. Research shows that this not only would raise wages for workers who receive the minimum wage, but those earning more than the minimum wage. As a result, 38% of Black workers would benefit from a proposal to raise the minimum wage to $15 by 2024, compared to 23.2% of white workers. Ironically, college-educated Black workers face a larger absolute income gap relative to whites than those without a college education, while Black workers with less than a high school education earn $3,500 less than similarly educated white workers. In 2018, Black workers with a bachelor's degree and above earned $11,000 less than their white counterparts. So, based on this report, Renaissance Man, what's your opinion on this?
Yeah, it shows it dispels a lot of myths. It's funny you start talking about unionization, because you just had a vote the other week down in Alabama and Bessemer, where basically they had the majority of the workers were Black, I believe, at an Amazon facility, and they actually voted against the union.
Yeah.
As the report said, unions have traditionally closed wealth gaps between Blacks and whites. When you look, like it also stated that unionized work, I'm sure it's mainly focusing on blue collar, that those jobs pay significantly higher wages than non-union, which we know that Black people are overly represented in the trades, Black men specifically, and judging by some of the rhetoric we hear, a lot of people won't believe that is the best route for Black men to go is the trades. But they then turn around and push this narrative of the right, of do for self and up by your bootstrap in this narrative. And I don't think they realize that within that narrative is going to be some anti-union sentiments as well. You hear it from even people like Thomas Sowell, who will argue against things like unions and the minimum wage when these things have historically helped the Black community. So it just dispels some of the myths. I think it also shows when you go back to the unionization piece, I think it also ties back to what we were talking about with Joe Biden's infrastructure plan, how that was focused on unionized construction jobs. That's another opportunity. But then when you also go to the minimum wage piece, like we were talking about earlier, you had a lot of workers who basically were very vulnerable. Like you said, Black people in general face the prospects of, we always heard last hired, first fired, things along those lines. So of course, something that's really going to be concentrated towards people at the bottom is just disproportionately going to help us. And when you listen to some of the pushback that comes against, $15 minimum wage, that, they say, it's going to push people out of business. Companies can't afford it. Yet you've heard even CEOs of companies come out and say, hey, like McDonald's, I believe, he came out and said, hey, we could pay people $15 an hour. There might be some minimal job loss, but it would help with productivity as well as worker morale. So, and I believe the GAO basically came out and said that you'd be looking at, I want to say maybe roughly 1 million jobs lost, but they talked about how many people would be lifted out of poverty. So you're talking about lifting millions of people out of poverty with something like this at the expense of some jobs being lost that, truth be told, are probably going to go by the way of the wayside when you start looking at automation and things like that. And then additionally, if you just look at inflation in general, I believe if you just follow I want to say like 3% inflation since the last time the minimum wage was raised, it would be, I want to say, at around $11 or $12 an hour right now. So when you're talking about 15, a lot of these proposals aren't even talking about phasing it in immediately. You're talking about roughly mid-2025 when you're talking about this actually coming into effect. So, add in some more years of inflation. So at the end of the day, you may be talking about, in real dollars, between now and then, a $3 increase in wages, but it just hasn't kept up. And some economists have talked about this explicitly about it. Just if you actually tied it to it, if you actually just followed over time, how basically these people haven't had a raise essentially in, I want to say about 20 years. Now, correct me if I'm wrong on the federal piece. Even if the Fed said it, that's only for federal work. Can't companies still follow state minimum wage? Because I believe Georgia.
They do follow state minimum wage. But if the government is the biggest employer of Black people, right, then that $15 minimum wage raise at the federal level makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, absolutely. No, the only distinction I was making, because I believe Georgia, when I was doing we were doing some work at a food bank, and one of the things that they talked about was Georgia was one of the few states that actually did not follow federal minimum wage, which I believe right now is $7.25 an hour. So theirs was like, I want to say like $5.50 because it was regulated by the state. So it would be no guarantee for everyone, but I would imagine entities that got federal money, some sort of federal money, are going to be held to that. Definitely federal contracting. So I think if it was mandated, I think just competitiveness would sort of make up for that in the sense of, hey, if people see that they can go make $15 an hour, it's going to put wage pressures on everyone else in the industry.
Yeah. I mean, if we look at the difference, right? So minimum wage right now at $7.25 federal minimum wage would bring you up to roughly $13,920. At $15 an hour annually, it would bring you up to roughly around $29,000, which is $29,000 that represents the gap between Black men and white men from an annual household income standpoint. Black men bring up the delta between the two is $29K. And so when people say fight for 15, it's not so much just of a liberal super ultra left sort of thing. It's a practicality standpoint that comes into this, right? Where you're saying the spending power for blacks, and more importantly black men, is predicated off of what that minimum wage is going to be, because now everybody else has to up their offers for labor. And so Fight for 15 makes a lot of sense in this regard. And the report that I just read actually came from a Senate Economic Council report. So it's not really based on someone else's opinion on the street that we don't know. This is actually coming from the government itself. It's saying, hey, and this is based on 2020. This is not from 30 years ago or some blogger on Medium. This is actually coming from all the analysis by the government itself, saying this is a big problem. Fight for 15, increase in minimum wage, racial inequality is creating these inequities. Something has to be done. First thing you can actually do is raise the minimum wage.
Yeah, the other thing that stands out too is you'll hear a lot of guys in the space talk about families and things like that, and men being leaders in the home again. And it's like, okay, that's all well and good, but one of the leading causes of divorce is finances, and you never really hear people address that piece of, okay, if you're going to have stable 2-parent led families and you want men in the breadwinner position, what are you going to do to basically offset what we talked about, last hired, first fired? What are you going to do about discrimination in the workplace? What are you going to do about wage disparity? These things.
Yeah, and that brings us to this actual article, because they expect you to alpha your way through it. This is from the Brookings Institute. The inheritance of black poverty. It's all about black men, or it's all about the men. Let me read this real quick. Black Americans born poor are much less likely to move up the income ladder than those in other racial groups, especially whites. But gender is a big part of the story too. As detailed in a new paper from the Equality of Opportunity Project, Race and Economic Opportunity in the United States, an intergenerational perspective by Raj Chetty, Nathaniel Hendren, and Maggie Jones, and Sonia Porter. As always, there is a huge amount of data and analysis in the newspaper, but the big finding is that race gaps in the intergenerational mobility largely reflect the poor outcomes for black men. Zoom this in. The report is another contribution to the growing literature showing that race gaps in the intergenerational persistence of poverty are in large part the result of poor outcomes for black men. Specifically, Chetty et al. Show that black men born to low-income parents are much more likely to end up with a low individual income than black women, white women, and especially white men. We conclude, based on the preceding analysis, that the black and white intergenerational gap in the individual income is substantial for men, but quite small for women. It is important to note, however, that this finding does not imply that the black-white gap in women's individual incomes will vanish with time. This is because black women continue to have substantially low levels of household income than white women, both because they are less likely to be married and because black men earn less than white men. In an attempt to estimate the impact of different marriage rates, Chetty et al. Calculate the intergenerational mobility rates of black and white men raised in both single parent and married families and find little difference. As they conclude, parental marital status has little impact on intergenerational gaps. In a new paper published today, we examine the same question in a different way. We confirm the stark differences in upward earnings mobility for black men compared to both black women and whites. We also confirm that black women, despite their solid earnings and mobility, have very low family income mobility. We then estimate the impact of racial differences in marriage rates by stimulating higher marriage rates among Black women. Like Chetty, we find no significant effects. Black and white children are born into very different economic circumstances. Almost half of Black boys and girls are in households in the bottom fifth of the income distribution, compared to just over 1 in 10 white children. There are then huge race gaps in the chances of being born to in or raised in a poor family. Gaps that were scarcely lower among children born in the early 1980s than they were among those born in the years around 1960. But what about the chances of escaping poverty as an adult? Using data on 4,200 Black and white Americans from the NLS Y97, we find that over half, 54% of Black men born into households in the poorest fifth of the family income distribution end up as individuals in the poorest fifth of the earnings distribution for the respective gender between the ages of 28 and 35, compared to the minority of white men, 22%, and white women, 29%, and Black women, 34%. So Black men make up the largest portion.
Yeah, I've seen this study before. And it essentially goes back to, hey, you've got to change the outcome of Black men, and it relates to earnings and the labor market. Yep. And they talked about marriage as well as those pieces as well. But that's what I really try to get at with a lot of these guys who are conservative and conservatives in general. That's one of my main issues with their ideology is that they want to talk about these institutions like they exist in a vacuum. And I'm like, they don't. When you start talking about disruptions in the economy, when you start talking about massive changes in your economy, that's when you end up with these disruptions in family life, because what people don't realize is that the family has always followed the economic structure of society. When you lived in a hunter and gathering, that's how people survived. You had people basically who focused more on clans and tribes. When you had a more agrarian-based society, your family was more based on basically the extended family, cousins, grandparents, aunts, uncles, all of that. When you move to the Industrial Revolution, that's when you see the rise of the nuclear family. What you could argue you're seeing now is post-industrial revolution going into fourth industrial revolution is a change again, where it may start as a nuclear family, but that's not, mother, father, leave it to beaver type of world may not be something that stays the norm. If you look at places like Sweden, which is more of a service-based, type of economy, and Scandinavia in general, their government has, they have a larger welfare state, and the majority of people don't get married when they have kids, and they don't stay together. So when guys come and say they want this vision of the world, I'm like, okay, you have to put an economy that's going to produce that in place, and people don't seem to get that.
Absolutely. Let me finish reading this real quick. In terms of their individual earnings, Black women have similar odds of escaping poverty as white women, though both of these groups lag behind the upward mobility of white men. These analyses don't consider the income of other family members. However, what happens when you look instead at adult family income as opposed to individual earnings? A very different picture emerges for Black Americans. Black women face a very high risk of being stuck in poverty at 62%, surpassing even the 50% risk faced by Black men. For whites, the odds of remaining stuck in poverty remain relatively low for both men and women. When we use a family income measure, the headline finding here is that among those who grew up poor, Black women are the only group showing a marked difference between the risk of being in the bottom quintile of the individual earnings distribution and the risk of being in the bottom quintile of the family income distribution. Whites do well on both counts, Black men do poorly on both counts. Black women do reasonably well on the first and very poorly on the second. The result is probably driven by the fact that Black women tend to create families with Black men who do poorly on both counts and thus bring down the family income results for Black women. So my analysis on this is that the desire to procreate downward is what's helping drive the poverty levels for children being born into, and as well as the community as a whole. And so you would want to marry up. And I see no one, at least in this space, really advocating for something as simple as a $15 minimum wage for Black men.
Yeah, the other thing that's kind of ironic is one of the things I'm studying right now in class in economics is inferior and normal goods. Children are actually considered inferior goods. For those of you all who are listening, a normal good is something that as your income increases, you buy more of. Versus think of, say, like a luxury car or something like that, or clothing or something like that, name brand label clothing. Versus an inferior good is something that as your income goes up, you buy less of. Children, when you put it in the scale of poorer countries versus richer countries, the higher people's incomes are, and in general, you can see it in this country, the higher people's incomes are, the fewer children they tend to have. So when I think of things like this, when you hear the stereotype of, the welfare queen and, women with all these kids, women and men with all these kids running around, I'm like, if that trend holds true, you're still making the argument that you need to make, that you need to raise these people's income. That essentially, if you don't want that and you want a more standardized practice of childbearing and fewer kids, then higher income is going to do that as well. But that's never in the discussion. It's always, hey, welfare state created this, do for self, this and that. And I'm like, if you look at, these things are not up for debate. You put two economists in a room, they're going to both say that with regards to the inferior goods piece. They may disagree as to the rationale behind it, as far as what's driving it. But in general, it is a trend that holds.
Yeah, definitely. I think in this space, and maybe this might be also a byproduct of just Black conservatism as a whole, regurgitating white conservative talking points. I think the fear here is that too much government intervention in terms of the minimum wage being raised, that somehow this is bad and we should alpha our way through $7.25 an hour. But I find this interesting because if the premise is that Black men, they need to do something for Black men, somebody needs to do something for Black men, something must be done, right? The federal minimum wage is a start. The next step would be something like an ACA, right? And then the next step after that would be upskilling of jobs for new industries such as renewable energies and so on and so forth. So these are sort of minor steps that need to be taken to get Black men out of this sort of situation that is also dragging Black women down, according to the Brookings Institute's report. That Black women who procreate and marry these guys or wed themselves to these guys tend to do really, really bad because those guys do really, really bad. So what other way how else do you correct this issue? Well, you're not going to alpha your way through this.
Yeah, what this is really showing with the lack of, when you see, like you were discussing earlier in the article, some of the progress that's been made by Black people since the civil rights movement, large government intervention there, Great Society, affirmative action, some of these things, as well as, some forced hiring practices changes, as well as, you could argue the rise of corporate America as far as having a more progressive view in the sense of hiring practices as well. But it goes back to show you that the middle class is a government creation. A lot of people have this notion that, hey, it's up by your bootstraps mentality, but
Yep.
it's a middle class creation. It has to be created. And if you're going to lift people out of poverty, it's going to have to be government sponsored, because that's the only institution that has enough far-reaching effects in the economy that it can create change, as well as has enough economic power behind it, because there's no institution spends more money than the government. So this is sort of reinforcing that very concept, because that's the ironic thing with a lot of the conservative movement in general, is they're anti-government, but you want this, view of leave to beaver, 2-parent home, suburban, mom stay at home with the kids, dad's the breadwinner. That was created post-war boom by the government through things like creation of FHA, GI Bill, good paying unionized jobs, all of those things. So it's like you want this vision, but you don't even know what built the vision in the first place.
Yeah, and if you want to go back to the 1950s, they were paying a substantially higher tax rate. They were paying something like north of 60%, if I remember correctly.
Absolutely.
Yeah, under the Obama administration, they were paying 35%. Trump came in, they dropped it to 21%. And now Biden wants to raise it to 28. And so, to your point, only government can really move at scale. This is not an individual fight. This is a top-down, policy-based initiative that needs to be brought to the forefront. A lot of these conservatives, smaller government, we see what smaller government does in these small conservative enclaves: West Virginia, South Carolina, Mississippi, Arkansas, all of these sort of places, and New Hampshire too. All of these sort of places don't really have the infrastructure necessary politically and industrially to, supplement its people on the ground. And so they tend to live very backwards in comparison to somewhere like New York City, Atlanta, proper, LA, Austin, Texas. These sort of rapid, accelerated environments that typically tend to be very progressive outperform conservative areas. But they would never acknowledge that the main point here is that if you're a Black conservative, you probably want to look at this a little bit deeper, because if this is where we are in 2021, what's going to happen in 2025, 2030? It's going to be even worse. Less jobs due to automation, Black men working jobs that have very high risk, that can be easily replaced due to automation, and have less skills to move up. And so their upward mobility tends to be stymied, and thus their ability to procreate and have economic mobility, upward mobility for their children also, tends to impact them as well.
Yeah. Like you said, and as technology grows, more and more jobs are going to be, I already said in the article that people who were Black were already in these at a high risk for jobs that can be automated, and that's only going to increase with more and more technology coming online. I was talking, maybe it's on this podcast or another podcast, about even some of these blue collar jobs. When you start looking at, welding in different places and things like that, there's going to be an element of that can be roboticized. Now, maybe if you're talking about like underwater or something like that, or very unique type of cuts, yeah, those may be preserved, but just general welding skills and things like that, you're going to have a lot of machines that are going to be able to do those things. So even the trades aren't necessarily a foolproof shield against that. So you're definitely going to need some sort of union protection, as well as bargaining, to go about dealing with that influx of technology and and how I guess you sort of remake the social contract. And now moving with the minimum wage piece, it's the same thing there. You're going to have technology that's going to come online that's going to displace people, and you're essentially going to have all these productivity gains that are going to go to the producer and none flowing to the worker. So it's as if you don't have it with all the productivity gains that have happened just over the past 30 years, very few outside of white collar jobs have gone to the worker. So going back to what we were saying, it's long overdue. And if you don't, you're only going to exacerbate the wealth gap that exists. And then B, also, you're going to, you're basically going to put people even further behind in the sense of it. There's going to, if you can't get this passed, what's going to be really the incentive to raise wages? It's not going to happen in the natural market. It's going to have to be forced. It always has been.
Yeah, policy. Policy is the name of the game here. So, hey, thank you, Renaissance, for joining me on this, man. I really appreciate it. Please like, share, and subscribe, and check us out on Twitter as well. All the links will be in the description beneath the video.